I think, I mean, there's two things that kind of come to mind out of that, really. One is, I know in my nearest sort of, I call it high street, I don't know what you call it, town centre, I suppose. There's a Chinese restaurant that's been shut for about 3 years. They've recently been trying to get planning permission to convert the whole, it's typical Chinese takeaway ground floor residential flat on 2 floors above it. And they've been trying to get the rights to convert that into a fully residential. And it's being resisted by the local authority because it's within the town centre boundary. They've got policies on loss of retail area. But actually, my view is that it's a waste of time, in the sense that there are a number of vacant units within the town centre. This unit has been vacant for 3 years. It's literally the last unit, and actually, it stands slightly alone. There's kind of that and one next to it, which is another pizza shop, which has been empty for a couple of years. And if you looked at it from an urban design point of view, you would say, you know what, let's let those 2 units go, let them get converted to residential. Great use, and actually, if there are people that want to move into those units, we'll direct them to the other ones that are in the heart of the town centre that are standing empty. And it's almost that kind of right sizing, I suppose. And it's you don't want the gap tooth high street. What you want to do is say, well, what's the right size? Maybe some of the peripheral, the ends, we kind of let it contract slightly to a size that's more sustainable, but that it's then vibrant in the middle rather than being too spread out. And I think the other point that you were making about certainly the resi conversion permitted development has been a major issue. I know, when we were looking for an office 5-6 years ago, we actually looked at some locally that we could have cycle to in 5 minutes, and they were the offices above retail units on the local high street. And they didn't. It was just as the policy had changed, and no one wanted to rent them. And we were kind of being actively. We had one agent in particular who I'm sure was on purpose not coming back to people because they wanted to show that there was no demand for it as an office space, because they wanted to convert the upper floors into residential, and they were kind of actively putting off commercial people that actually wanted to move into them. So I think it is an issue. Richard Summers, I saw you had your hand up. Sorry, before I went off.
Thanks, Paul. I just wondered if anybody in the group has got a experience of the kind of other end of workplace, which is sort of large scale office buildings. The sort of thing that was being built in the 70s and 80s, and obviously before that as well. There are still people who maybe clients for master plans who hanker after the mega building, the mega occupier, the central business district model, and wonder whether anybody's got any experience of where that is happening and is a viable kind of entity, and maybe the opposite, whether it isn't, and whether it's purely WeWork buildings and that's it.
Silence from the group. I mean, one thing I would say is I think it was yesterday, wasn't there? Was an article from or an interview with the head of Barclays. He was saying that he thinks that the days of Barclays taking on big offices are over, and that they'll be moving, considering a lot more about how they allocate office space. Well, there's a hand up. Whose hand up was that? I just saw Sean. Go on.
Well, as a Croydon resident councillor, the Home Office has just signed off on a large office development at East Croydon just a couple of weeks ago. But I was just looking at retail office vacancy rate. South Bank, it's Paribas something was saying it's only 2 or 3% on the South Bank, and sort of 5 to 10% in many areas of the city centre of London. If social distancing is going to be a requirement both in public transport and in offices, you just physically can't get the people into the existing office stock that we have. Permitted development, we've just heard, has stripped out most of the suburban 60s and 70s offices that existed in the suburbs. Croydon's lost most of its to permitted development. So the idea, the Evening Standard had an article about the tube running at 15% capacity for it to be safe for social distancing. It does seem to be a case that suburban areas may not be able to get the large office blocks being developed in the future, but they could have a sort of sort of Phoenix-like work and office on a smaller scale coming back. So that's one of the reasons why I think I'm personally against this sort of loss of smaller office spaces and ground floor, because if large-scale offices aren't going to be viable in the future, it does seem to make the case both to reduce the commuting and smaller office spaces, that the suburbs have an opportunity to meet that demand.
Can I add about the large-scale office, the large open place? I think this is a concept it's spread in the post-war period and really held sway in the MBA era. People think that they get used to the noise in a large open plan office. The research suggests that they don't, and that their productivity is permanently impaired. So that's another reason why these large open plan, large floor plate offices may be a thing of the past, as well as the difficulty of social distancing and the spreading of miasmas and horrible things like that. Anyway, that's from me.
Yeah, Colin, do you want to say something?
My question is, when we talk of retail going to residential, does that mean that the residential becomes a unitary use class in its own right, or does it take on a dual use capacity? How does the use class work in that relationship? In other words, why would we be worried too much if one function changes from another function? Maybe a few years later it will function back again. If I had a house on the ground floor and was running an architect's office, I might, in my early days, like to have a live-work setup where I could do both, run a commercial place and live either in the same area or above. Noel and I had a place in Westbury which was a live-work situation, and I think the council just designated it 50-50 in terms of business rate and living, and they didn't really take any notice as to how much was occupied residential or commercial. And I'm wondering, do we try to be far too categoric in the way we designate the uses? Do we need a lot more flexibility in our thinking? I remember at the same time, when I was in Westbury, people in San Francisco were all worried because houses were being taken over by offices, and then over here we were doing the reverse. It was something like that, and I kind of like wonder, with changes of economic periods, why are we trying to fix things so much?
Anyone else want to come in or give any comments or thoughts or response to Colin's?
It seems to me if we're arguing for flexibility, we need flexibility, and maybe you could zone areas in a certain place where flexibility is acceptable. But I just find it problematic, because when we were in Westbury, the ideal for us was that we could have lived in our live-work location and taken an office elsewhere, or we could have started the office there and lived elsewhere, whichever was easiest for us commercially to do at the time. It didn't matter. We were quite happy to live in a live-work environment where lots of things were buzzing around. It was fine.
I think my experience is that probably quite a lot of it goes on anyway, and it only really becomes an issue when it becomes a problem. Certainly where our studio is in Hackney Wick, I think there's a lot of, there are people living in buildings that are classified as industrial, and people working in buildings that are classified as residential, and all sorts going on. So I think it only really becomes an issue if someone decides to, I don't know, start lead smelting in their back garden or something, which would probably cause a bit of an issue.
My worry is that if our office in Westbury had grown to say 6 or 7 in size, that would have been okay because it was a designated live-work zone. But if we'd been in a living area or something like that, and your office had grown to about 6 or 8 or something like that, the neighbours would complain, and probably rightly so, according to the law, which makes you feel really vulnerable sometimes.
Colin, I think the idea you just mentioned about kind of zoning or identifying certain areas. I mean, that is something we have been trying to explore in one of our master plans, which has just been submitted as an outline application, where we have identified obviously the main local center and town center, but then identified other areas which we call kind of secondary mixed use zones. And the requirement for those is that, as I said, mentioned before, that ground floor needs to be built to a higher spec, so a higher floor to ceiling height. And I mean, we have located these where we could envisage in the future, like, for example, small shops or offices to pop up, like a corner shop. So in kind of next to primary schools, for example, where there's kind of a lot of activity next to key features like big open lakes. So it's not everywhere we've kind of allowed the flexibility, but we've gone beyond the normal local center, which you can see in these master plans. I mean, we are testing it through the planning application process at the moment, so I can't tell you if it's actually going to work. But that is certainly kind of one approach which we are trying to kind of build in flexibility into new developments.
Yeah, go on, Andrew.
It'd be interesting to see how that works, because we were asked a similar question when we were advising East Devon on Cranbrook. The council wanted quite a large town centre area, and the developers were a consortium of volume house builders. So it wasn't their area of expertise, and they couldn't see whether they really wanted to build 12 hectares of town centre development. They were much keener on building smaller residential units, and we suggested that perhaps there should be some flexibility, because we weren't entirely sure how much retail or town centre uses could be built. So we suggested a similar thing, that they should zone some of the areas that were so that they were flexible, and they had a requirement to build a higher ceiling height on the ground floors within those areas if they built anything, but also that there would be a permitted right for people to extend up to 3 floors high, or a certain height, so that anyone who bought a residential property there would know there was an opportunity for their neighbours to potentially move in with a different use, so they were prepared for that. But on the other hand, they also had the flexibility themselves to potentially add a story or convert the use. So kind of like this flexible town centre use class, which seems to me to be a pretty good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, Joe?
It's maybe worth recalling that the Thatcher government introduced what it called enterprise zones several decades ago, which were meant to be these experimental, relatively planning-free parts of towns and cities where things could happen outside of the use classification orders. As I recall it, none of them produced anything of any great quality. Whether they worked economically, I can't remember, but certainly in urban design terms, none of them produced anything significant. And I guess what they lacked were a design code. I mean, maybe the term design code hadn't been introduced at that time. But if you did that kind of experimental zone with a strict design code from an urban design point of view, the kind of terms that we've been suggesting tonight, it's certainly worth experimenting in a few isolated cases with that kind of enterprise.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, go, Colin.
Yeah. I live in an enterprise zone where I live just down near Tower Bridge. It was part of the enterprise zone because it went right up to the Pool of London where Hayes Galleria is, and I live just near Butler's Wharf. And so near that area, the David Mellor kitchen shop was built. I think it was it Hopkins, or I forget who designed the building. And then Terence Conran lived on the roof. Now, I think that building is the David Mellor shop is gone now. So obviously it was a little bit of a backwater commercially. So what's left there now is, I think, Terence Conran's offices. And so what happens is that it seemed a good idea at the time, but some of the the gloss wore off because there wasn't enough footfall in some of those areas. So they kind of work. I mean, there's Brown's restaurants just down on the river. It struggles a little bit, and then the design museums in that area as well. Well, that's moved over to South Kensington, where the footfall is greater and the site's a bit more prestigious in the Commonwealth building. So these things change a bit. And what did happen when Terence Conran built Le Pont de la Tour and Chop House and all of those, that all went bankrupt. And then, of course, it revived again afterwards. And it went along really well for a while. But now the whole area has been kind of like slightly downgraded a little bit, mainly because of the building of the Shard and much more rooftop type restaurants and buildings that have gone over in the city just near Liverpool Street, the Shard, the walkie-talkie. So that's taken a bit of the trade. But once upon a time, Le Pont de la Tour was like the premier restaurant in London, because that's where Bridget Jones' Diary was filmed in part of it, and then Blair met up with Bill Clinton at Le Pont de la Tour, that sort of thing. So some of these areas have their ebb and flow. It's kind of like it's carried on, but I don't think it's quite got the same prestige as the area had, say, like 15, 20 years ago.
Mm.
So
Stephen, I saw your hand up.
Thanks. Yes, of course. Canary Wharf was an enterprise zone originally, and that had to go bankrupt twice before it finally got traction and turned into the success that it is now, depending on how you define success. But I think, although I don't have a great antipathy for enterprise zones, they are a bit of an acceptance of the failure of planning as an activity. They are an exception to the rule, and surely we should be getting the rules right in the first place so that we didn't need exceptions. And flexibility must be built into the way that we establish and operate rules. But I can't imagine that any local authority at the moment would be objecting to the widest variety of commercial activities in a town centre if they contribute to its vitality and viability. So I don't think use classes are necessarily the answer to it. If a local authority is behaving responsibly, it ought to be saying, yes, come and do that here because it's going to contribute to the vitality of the place. So make the planning process as smooth as possible, and don't worry too much about the regulations. It's the effectiveness with which they're applied that's important.
Scott, I saw your hand up. Before I go to Scott, just to say, Scott will be hosting next week's session. I'll get the plug in now. We're talking about housing, public realm and parks next week, and Scott will be hosting that. But what did you want to say about current topic?
I think obviously, like, there's other places that have done this, and I think the use class is a very rigid system, and zoning, which was so strict and so defining development in the US, a lot of cities, quite big, medium-sized cities, are going to form-based zoning. So it's more about the form and not what the use is inside. And they might include all the different uses that could go inside there, except for residential, let's say, in a high street setting. And also, when I was in Melbourne, they did they focused a lot on performance guidance and guidelines and how each space had to perform. So again, residential is the exception, but for the mixed uses, in lots of areas, you can have different types of mixed uses. It depends how it performed down the street, even the form of the building. It depended on whether you could have a cafe culture there, based on the wind condition, the sunlight. And I think those are the types of things that will make a more successful high street mixed uses. The one thing during the lockdown that I'd like to ask you about and get people's input on is the idea of the local centers. And I assume, and I think, they become more important as more people work at home, or potentially when I lived away from Bethnal Green and moved there last year again, there's co-working everywhere. So home working isn't just working in your home, but working in your neighborhood. So cafes, plant shops, all these different types of spaces, people work during the day. They had the social activity. They had a 2-minute walk, 5-minute walk to these places. And I wonder what your views are on how successful local centers are going to be to transform after this. And also, do you think it'll be at the expense of the town or city centers?
It's an interesting point. I just see Justine's put in the chat as well. The idea is, are we actually looking at a kind of a difference between short term and long term? While there's no vaccine or cure for COVID, are people going to still be reluctant to use public transport, still want to work from home, even when maybe we're allowed to go back into offices? And will that change in the longer term? I think it's about 6 weeks, isn't it, to form new habits or something. So it'll be interesting to see, will people kind of go back to their old ways, or will they get used to the new ways and prefer them? I don't know if anyone's got any takes on that at all.
There was recently an article that basically was saying that productivity has gone up since we're all working from home, and also the fact that our quality of life, yes, we're all in a higher state of stress, but other parts of our lives we're enjoying more. And I think that the equity issue is a big thing for me, in terms of those that have will continue to have, those that don't have are going to be even more impact. So the deprived areas are going to be completely decimated in so many different ways. And I think that there are different elements to what will happen in the short, medium and long term to high streets, local centres, city centres. I think city centres will be more impacted than the smaller centres, although in the past the smaller centres have suffered more. I think people's preferences, as I think it was Andrew said at the beginning, is we're enjoying being able to live and work locally, and I think that there is a different quality to life that will impact in the short, medium and longer term.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah, go on, Graham.
I'm going to say, I think there's a huge unknown here, I suppose, is the extent to which people will have sort of choice and agency about how they work, and how much sort of in the next few months will many organizations allow a little bit of flexibility, but there'll be a fundamental way of working that they're kind of subscribing to, and that people won't have. That maybe in some industries they might have some flexibility, but in others they'll be told, frankly, get back to work in the office. I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether there'll be enough sort of agency allowed to, particularly say workers who haven't got much access to working from home, as to will they have the kind of bargaining power to say, frankly, if you want me to continue working, someone's going to have to subsidize a space for me somewhere. And will that get into quite tricky conversations where some staff members maybe could insist on it and others would try and negotiate it, and others may be completely unsuccessful in negotiating it and finding that they've got very little agency, particularly if in the next 6 to 12 months there may well be organizations shedding labor because of a recession.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. It's I always found that kind of before all this, that it was certainly in some meetings that I've been to, the feeling was there was always a pressure on you to be at the meeting in person. And sometimes people would say, can I phone in or can I video conference in? And it was always, oh, well, the tech never works. And they'd be sort of saying, well, it's a long way for me to go for a half-hour meeting, or a meeting that I don't really need to be at. But it was kind of frowned upon that you weren't there. And of course, now everyone's at home and everyone's dialing into every meeting, and it's kind of, the world's going on and it's all fine. And I'm a bit nervous that when we come out of this in the coming weeks, and particularly if it's a staged lockdown where, some people might be okay, but if you're over a certain age or you've got a certain medical condition, you're still expected to work from home. It'll be quite, it'll be interesting to see how that works. And will there be a lot more openness, or will it still sort of be, well, everyone else is going to be there in person. Why aren't you going to be there in person, Paul? So I think it'll be interesting to see how we come out of it and how we work to that.
Paul, could I say something, please?
Yeah, go on.
Thanks very much. Are you first of all, just as a process question, are you actually recording or seeing the blue hand that some of us are flagging up? Megan is one.
I am, but I have to keep moving my cursor to be able to see it. So.
All right. Okay. So I know Megan was aware as well. I just want to say hello to everybody I know and hello to everybody I don't know. what I found quite interesting was the conversation primarily around the built environment. There were some conversations about flexibility. I link that with change of behaviour and how far that might go and what people are experiencing. Certainly wanted to touch on that. A little bit of an anecdotal. I've found that I've started unable to access and use a robot that will deliver my food to me. Very simple concept in so much that it's a bit like a cold box with a lid on the top, 6 wheels and an antennae and a flag, and I put my order in through an op to the local co-op 500 meters down the road, put my order in, and 20 minutes later this thing comes along, driverless, autonomous, and arrives at my doorstep with the food that I've ordered. I don't know if I will carry on like that, but it's certainly an example of how my behavior has changed in terms of actually the food or the product coming to me rather than me going to where I might be able to get the goods. And that to me seems quite significant, a question of how much that pattern might change significantly. And again, another aspect that will undermine the conventional, whether it be the city centre or even the local centre, and certainly the high street, in terms of people that take up more of that patterning. Deliveries, again, I've used an awful lot more and are using those more even before the present crisis. So that was really just an aspect I wanted to cover. How are people seeing different behaviour patterns coming in, and do they think that there will be some element of permanent change coming through?
Megan, did you want to say something? I see the blue hand up.
Megan, got yeah.
Yeah.
Double question.
Not kind of directly related necessarily to the use of robots, but it is kind of related to transport. So the local authorities that I'm speaking to, I think, are all very concerned about public transport and not knowing what's going to happen. So I think that's something that they're trying to find out, figure out kind of what's going to work. But if even a fraction of the people who are currently using buses in some cities end up coming by car, it's going to be absolute gridlock. And I think local authorities are aware of that. They're just not quite sure what to do about it. I think the point about walkable neighborhoods, the 15 or 20 minute neighborhood, is something that I'm also seeing local authorities talk more about, often from a public health perspective. But I think they're still seeing local centres as primary, either spaces for community use, so having a library, health centre, whatever based there, and retail. I've not seen any discussion about having them be the centre for office use. And it'll be interesting to see if that does change because of this, whether or not there is kind of more of an understanding that we need to kind of pull that back out. What impact that has on the city centre, I'm really not sure.
Okay. Well, I should just say, I've just realised that the time, so it is 6:30. This notionally is a 5:30 to 6:30 event. What we've generally been doing is everyone just keeps going until we all run out of puff and there's only one person left on the call who kind of turns off the lights. So thank you to everyone who has come along. Please feel free to stay. We're going to continue on talking, but also feel free to go and get your dinner or go for your daily exercise or whatever you want to do. So we won't be offended if you disappear. But for those that want to hang around for a bit longer, please feel free to. And as I said, we will be back here next week talking about housing, public realm and parks, which Scott will be hosting. So if you've got to shoot off, hopefully we'll see you again next week.